What's up everyone? Welcome back to my channel. My name's Jacqueline and today is my wrap up for April. So we're gonna get right into the stats of this video. I actually read a little bit less than I thought I was gonna be able to. I ended up finishing with 7 books for this month, but I actually had some really great reads this month. So for the stats, out of those 7 books, I read 3 thrillers, I read 1 novella / horror, and I read 3 contemporary romance, which is absolutely crazy because I didn't think I was a huge fan of like contemporary romance, but I finally found out that I love Taylor Jenkins Reid and I literally binged 3 of her books this month. So out of those 7 books, I read 4 from audiobooks, 1 as an ebook, and 2 as physical books. So that was actually pretty surprising because I've always said that I'm like a physical book person and I usually hate audiobooks, and I've become better at reading ebooks, but I think because I was just traveling so much for work, if I wouldn't have like listened to any of the audiobooks, I wouldn't have finished like any books. I literally would have finished like 3 books. So I'm really glad that I was listening to the audiobooks, and I think it's because I really I listened to the Taylor Jenkins Reid as audiobooks, and so the 3 books that I read of hers were just so easy to listen to. I love the narrator, and so it just turned out really, really great. I read 2,243 pages, which I believe was close to what I read in March. I think it was around the 2,000 mark. So I feel like that's kind of the same area, I guess. And then I only gave 1 book 3 stars. I gave 3 of the books 4 stars, and I gave 3 of the books 5 stars. So I feel like I had a really good reading month, and I think it was because I stayed in like a certain comfort zone that I had. Once I realized that I really loved the One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid, I just decided to kind of like stay in that area, and it didn't disappoint. I loved them all. Now, also out of those books, 4 of them were from the library, which most of those were audiobooks from the library. And then 1 of them was from Scribd because I actually did my free trial, and I'm gonna continue having Scribd just for the audiobook's sake because I really enjoy listening to the audiobooks while I'm going to work, and I found that it really helps my reading while I'm really busy. And then 2 of them were gifted. 1 was an actual physical copy gifted, and 1 was an ebook gifted. So now that we went through those stats, we'll go through the actual books that I read. The first book that I read in April was A House at the Bottom of the Lake by Josh Malerman, and I gave this 4 stars. I actually read it with Gabby from Gabby Reads, and it was our first buddy read, and it was like super fun. We both really, really enjoyed it, and I feel like I wouldn't have appreciated the story as much if I hadn't read it with Gabby. It's actually a very symbolic book and has a lot of like metaphors and stuff in it, so it was really cool to like bounce ideas off of each other with a buddy read and kind of just be like, you know, what did you think about it? Oh, I thought this, and like all that kind of stuff. I know it sounds crazy, but it actually was like really fun to read. It's about these 2, I think they're in high school. It's like these 2 high schoolers who decide to go on like their first date together. And while they're on their first date, they're like out on this lake, and they find that there's a house like underneath the lake. And they get like super excited, and they want to go get like scuba gear and stuff. And they end up diving underneath and kind of like playing house. And they just become like so infatuated with this house and like how it's their house and no one else knows about it. And there's like a magical paranormal element to it, I guess. And so you find out at the end, just like kind of what happens. You don't really find out what happens. Like it's kind of one of those ambiguous endings. And so you kind of have to just think about it in your mind, I guess. But it was just a really, really cool read. It was scary for me. Like it is in the horror genre, but I know a lot of people on Goodreads rated it low because they said it wasn't scary and it shouldn't be horror. But in my opinion, it was actually freaky when I was reading it, and I got like chills and stuff with all of the stuff that they were talking about because it just felt so like eerie. Like the way that Josh Malerman wrote it, I just felt like his adjectives and his description of like where they were and what was going on was just so eerie. I just loved it. It was actually a really good read. I just knocked off a point because of not knowing exactly what was going on in the book, so that's why. The next book that I read was One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and I'm a fan of her now. This book really got me into loving her, and I would have to say that she is one of my favorite authors. This book was just, oh my gosh, it broke my heart. So it was about this girl, Emma, who marries her high school sweetheart, Jesse, and they have a couple years, no, actually they only have 1 year of marriage, I believe, together, and he has to like go on this like job, and I believe it's like right on their like 1 year anniversary, and so he has to go away on this job, and he ends up getting into a helicopter crash, and they believe that he is dead, and she grieves like, oh my gosh, the scenes of her grieving are just absolutely like, I felt like my own heart was broken. It just like, oh my gosh, like she just got like so depressed there for a second, and I just like, if that happened to like my own husband, like I know that that's what the situation like that I would be in, so I just felt like it was written so beautifully with that. And then it becomes where like she moves on, and after like, I think it's like 4 or 5 years of like grieving and finally moving on, she falls in love with this other guy named Sam, and they actually get engaged. And as soon as they get engaged, Jesse actually isn't dead and comes back, and she has to pick between her fiance and her husband. And it's just really crazy. Like, I rated it 5 stars. It was an amazing read. And the ending, like, Taylor Jenkins Reid is just so good at writing endings. And I felt like I didn't feel upset by the ending. It was just like the perfect scenario, and it was amazing. But like, what I loved about this book is you really didn't know who you were voting for. Like, were you voting for Jesse, who's the husband, who did nothing wrong? Like, it wasn't his fault that he had to survive years before he got to, come back. But it's not Sam's fault either. So you're voting for Sam, who fell in love with Emma, and they're a really great couple. Like, oh my gosh, like, I'm so fangirling over this book because it was really good. I really loved it. The next book that I read was My Lovely Wife by Samantha Downing. And I believe that this book just came out, I think it was like at the end of March that it got released. And I ended up reading it, and I gave it 4 stars. It was an okay thriller. It didn't have any like super crazy twists and turns throughout the book. I remember that I was about, I guess, almost 3/4 of the way through the book before it even like revealed anything or had any twists. So I feel like this is a good book for those of you who may not be huge thriller readers, but you want to kind of like start with a light thriller read. It was a crazy book because it's based off of this married couple who the husband like goes out and finds ladies for his wife to kill. And like, that's the whole book. So the story was like great, but then there were times where I was like bored because I felt like the story wasn't really going anywhere. Like, they just kind of repeated that. But then the last ending part, like, that was pretty good about like what happened. And there was a little bit of a reveal at the end. So that was really good. So that's why I rated it 4 stars. I think a lot of people will really like the book. It just didn't hold up to my thriller expectations. The next book that I read was The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides, I think is how you would say it. I'm not exactly sure. But this book I also read with Gabby. It was another buddy read. I swear, I would have not read any books this month if it wasn't for audiobooks and like buddy reads. Like, oh my gosh. And this book I gave 4 stars. It actually was a pretty good thriller book. I read it all in one day. But the ending, I docked the star just a bit, so it's only 4-star rating for me. I don't know, I think I'm super picky with thrillers. Like, either they have to have a lot going on, because if I'm too bored, then I only give it a 4-star rating. But then sometimes they have like too much going on at the end, and it doesn't really make sense, and then I dock a star. Like, I'm just super picky. I'm so sorry, people. There was a little bit of a boring part in there, but for the most part, it actually was a pretty good paced book. So what I did like about this book was that it all was based in like a psychiatric ward, like a mental crazy hospital thing. So it really reminded me of like American Horror Story or something. And so I loved how like creepy it was. Now, why it was called The Silent Patient, that's kind of why I docked a star off, because that part didn't make sense to me. Like, even after I found out the big reveal, which was actually a really good one, it just didn't, I don't know, I just didn't understand the whole silent patient thing. And if you have read it, you might know what I'm talking about. Like, I don't understand why the patient was silent. I just don't understand it, but no spoilers. But if you do know what I'm talking about, definitely go ahead and leave a comment down below and let me know like why you think it was called that. I don't know. I just don't get it. But it actually was a pretty good thriller, 4-star read for me. I read it in one day. There were a couple boring parts. But the story is about this lady who is charged with killing her husband, and she doesn't talk, like, at all. After this happened, she doesn't talk. And this detective who you're like reading about in the book is trying to get her to talk. So he's like going to the psych ward and he's like doing things for her and trying to figure out like who killed who and all this kind of stuff. So it actually was a pretty interesting story. It just didn't make sense in the end. So now the next book I read was After I Do by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and shocker, it's a 5-star read for me. I loved this book so much also. Like, oh my gosh, they're so good. So this one is about Lauren and Ryan, who are a married couple. They've been married for a couple years, and they realize that they just don't really like each other anymore. Like, they're fighting all the time, they're nitpicking, and let me just tell you that that part of the book was written so well. I was listening to the audiobook on my way to work, and I felt like, I mean, this is a bad thing, but like I felt like I was literally becoming depressed because I felt like I was in the fights that they were having. Like, I could almost see myself having the same fight with my husband and stuff. And so it was just so real, and I love books like that. That's one of the reasons why I'm such a big fan of Colleen Hoover, because I love real life stories and real life situations. Like I said, they were like fighting all the time. They didn't love each other, and they finally realized, they were like, okay, we need to do something about this, because like we pretty much hate each other's guts. And instead of getting an actual divorce, they took 1 year off, almost like a separation, but not quite. Like, they literally had to separate, but they weren't allowed to contact each other for a whole entire year. So you were allowed to sleep with whoever you wanted, you were allowed to do, you know, whatever you wanted, but you had to live without that person and, you know, figure out what you actually liked about them, or if you still didn't like them. And so again, this story is literally just, it touches my heart so much. I love the ending again. It was just written so beautifully. It was just, you know, it really makes you think about, you know, what you would do in that situation, and how, yes, some marriages are a struggle, but sometimes you're not looking at the deepest part of it. And I know there were some quotes that I loved, but since I was listening to it on my drives to work, I didn't get to write down some of the quotes, but oh my gosh, they were just so amazing. And I love like the grandma, she's like, marriage is hard. Like, okay, marriage just doesn't come easily, but you know, there's sacrifice in marriage. Like, I think she says something like, marriage, you're not always going to be happy at every second. And I think that's what some people think. Like, they think that if they're not happy at every single second, that like, oh my gosh, their marriage is falling apart. And I mean, like, I've been married for almost 4 years now, and I will say that like the first 1 to 2 years were actually the hardest, I feel like. But you know, there are times where we fight about stupid things, and like, you know, there's just stupid things that happen, or you get angry about stupid things. But like, in the meantime, like, I know that whenever I'm apart from my husband, that I'm always thinking about like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to be around him again. I can't wait to spend time with him. Or I think about, oh my gosh, like, I appreciate so much of what he does. And so I think that that's very important. Like, I feel like I'm about to cry, like, oh my gosh, but I feel like that's very important in a marriage, is to like actually, you know, be able to spend time apart from them, but in that time apart, realize how much you actually do love them. So if you're married, you'll probably like this book better than someone who isn't married, because I felt like I totally related to the situation. Now, the next book that I read was Reconstructing Amelia by Kimberly McCreet, and this was actually a book discussion that I did in my book club, which feel free to come join. I always have the link down below in my videos. Make sure that you fill out the questions in order to be accepted for membership, because we do only accept members that really want to participate and really want to read with us. But like I said, this was the book discussion. We did a weekly discussion, and so I finished this book after, I think it took me about 3 weeks because I was only reading a couple portions at a time. I only gave this book 3 stars because it wasn't super thrilling, although it did have a lot of interesting topics in it, which made a great book discussion. And so it was about this daughter who had jumped off the school building and committed suicide, but the mother thought that she didn't commit suicide. Like, she was like, no, my daughter was like a straight A student. She was, well loved. The mother was a single mother and worked a lot. So there were a lot of factors of bullying, secret groups, single motherhood, just social media in general. And it was a great book topic like that. But for me, it just was like a more in-depth thriller read, but not, I guess, more like a mystery and not exactly a thriller, because it wasn't very thrilling to like read throughout the book. But all in all, it was a pretty decent read, and it seemed like a lot of people in the book club also enjoyed it. But I've read one other book by Kimberly McCreet, and it's Where They Found Her, and that one was a 5-star read for me. So maybe if you're just starting out with Kimberly McCreet, you want to read that book instead. And then the last book that I read here in April was Maybe in Another Life by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and I think this one was my most favorite of all the Taylor Jenkins Reid I read, but I'm not sure, because every time I go back and I think about them, then I think something else is my favorite. But I think this is my favorite, and I think this is like one of my favorite books of all time. Like, it's pretty much up there with Colleen Hoover's All Your Perfects. Like, I freaking love this book so much. It was 5 stars. If I could, I would give it more stars. This one's about this girl named Hannah who has to make a decision one night on whether or not to go home with this guy, Ethan, who I think she dated a little bit in high school, but she had like moved back to where her best friend like Gabby lives and where this guy Ethan lives. I think it's like LA. And she like went out and like they all met at a party or whatever, and she had to decide like whether or not she was going home with Ethan. Well, it breaks off into 2 different like alternate like realities. So the story follows Hannah, where she does decide to go home with Ethan and her life from there. And then it follows Hannah, where she doesn't decide to go home with Ethan and how her life is from there. And so it's so crazy because there were similarities between like maybe some of her friends were the same, or maybe some of her actions were the same, but then there were so many other things that made you think about what decisions in your life did you choose that turned you into a different person or really had you on a different path in life. And oh my gosh, it's one of those books that really makes you think. And I love books like that. It was a great read, and I even listened to it on the audiobook, and I still loved every single second of it. Like, every time I finished driving, I just really wanted to keep listening to the book. And like, reading the actual synopsis of this book, it says, as the 2 alternate realities run their course, Maybe in Another Life raises questions about fate and true love. Is anything meant to be? How much in our life is determined by chance? And perhaps most compellingly, is there such a thing as a soulmate? And I think that's one of the things I love so much about in Taylor Jenkins Reid's books, is that there's usually, or well, not always, but there's usually like 2 different guys. And so like, for instance, Hannah goes home with Ethan and she has a great relationship with Ethan. And then Hannah goes home with, her best friend, and eventually meets a different guy. And you love both relationships all the time. Like, I never know who I'm voting for. And it like kind of irritates me, but at the same time, it really makes you think like, is there such a thing as one true love? Who would you pick? What would you do in that situation? And I just love it so much. Like, I just love it. So if you're a romance fan like me, I highly suggest that you read these books, because They really just got me going this whole month. Like, I just really wanted to read every single book that I could written by her. So if you've read any of the books that I've read, definitely let me know down in a comment what your thoughts were about them. And if you have anything that is kind of like these Taylor Jenkins Reads book that I've been reading, please let me know down in the comments, because I would love recommendations for more books for me to read that are just like this. That's all for this video. I hope you really enjoy it. Give it a thumbs up and definitely hit that subscribe button if you aren't subscribed yet. I'll see you all in another video. Bye everyone.